Are we live?
Hello, everyone.
We are.
Everyone who's joining us on Facebook and YouTube. I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe. You are in a real treat for today. I don't know if you can tell, but this is a union of some of CBC's meteorologists, and we're here to tell you about what kind of season we're coming out of, and of course, what kind of season we're going into. So I'm here on the West Coast, as you know. It's been a bit of a brutal winter, round two, and many of us are looking for spring. It's going to be slow coming, but I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions about that. I'm going to pass it over to Christy Climenhaga in Regina, who is covering sort of the central parts of the country. Christy?
Well, Johanna, most people here are very angry with me these days because it's not really like spring yet. We had so much snow this month, so everyone's looking forward, hoping it'll get better, hoping it'll get better. We've got some minus 20-degree temperatures this week, so I'm happy to answer your questions. I'm sorry I don't have better news, but I will be covering questions from Alberta, Saskatchewan, the north. If you've got a couple, fire away. We'll answer them as best as we can. And now, looking all the way to the east, I'm going to throw to Jay over in PEI. How's it going?
Yes, hi, my name is Jay Scotland, meteorologist with Charlottetown, or in Charlottetown here for Prince Edward Island and covering off the Maritimes today. And I think I'll also be touching on a little bit for Ontario and Quebec if there are any questions that come there about the spring season. More familiar with Atlantic Canadian weather at the moment, but we can take some questions regarding that as well. And unlike Christy, I think looking behind me out the window here in Charlottetown, I am a very popular guy today. I often remind folks that when it comes to weather, I just work in marketing. Mother Nature, she's the one who, if you have problems with production, she's the one in charge of production. But on days like this, blue sky, sunshine, I'm taking full credit. So not much to complain about today, certainly.
And Jay, I know you have a question already coming in because we are actually getting our questions on our phones. We're not ignoring you if you don't see us looking at you.
Yeah, we're looking down. Yeah, I've got, I'm using my laptop, by the way, old school. I'm not even using the mobile. We got a question here from Corbett from Summerside. He's asking me, are we going to have a good summer? A little too early to start really digging into how the summer is shaping up, but we're really focusing on our spring season. And I will say, I think spring is going to start out certainly once we look into the first week of April, when we really start to get in what we consider, certainly here in PEI, spring arrives a little later into the spring season. I do think towards the end of spring, we are going to see some warmer than normal temperatures heading into summer. So we are looking at a pretty cool start to spring, though. So that first week of April, and this will be across much of the country, certainly looking at Eastern Canada and here in Atlantic Canada. I know Johanna is probably going to be talking a lot about some of these teleconnections that do have a major influence on our weather and what we can expect over long periods of time, like seasons, for example. She'll be talking most likely about La Nina and a transition to a more neutral phase with that teleconnection. But looking at Atlantic Canada, by the time you get east of Quebec, it's really hard to start finding clues in terms of what our season is going to shape up like. Certainly El Nino, La Nina, that cycle has less of an influence east of Quebec. But looking at a couple of other oscillations, like the Arctic oscillation, for example, a couple of other really big overall global patterns, I do expect that we are looking at into early April. The right ingredients are there for a jet stream that will be less west to east and more meandering. And anytime you have a very slow, very weak jet stream that tends to meander, we start to get big ridges and big troughs. And it looks to be the case that into early April, certainly across much of, well, here in Atlantic Canada and across much of the country, we're going to see a big dip in the jet stream. And when you have a big dip in the jet stream, that's almost like opening the door and letting that cool air escape from the higher latitudes. And I do expect, at least into the early start of spring, for the first week of April or so, we are going to see temperatures that are pretty reflective of what we're seeing now. But as we get into April, that would be cooler than seasonal, because April's a transitional month where we see those temperatures start to rise quite quickly from the beginning of the month to the end of the month. So some cooler than normal temperatures in April. But as we take a look more to the middle and later spring, the biggest influence on our weather here, and I think Corbett in Summerside, you can attest to this, is the wind off the water. So we have to look at the sea surface temperatures. And right now, as we look south of Nova Scotia across the Gulf Stream, temperatures on those sea surface temperatures of the Atlantic are very warm compared to what would be normal. As we look off the coast of Newfoundland, there are some warmer than normal temperatures. I'm here on Prince Edward Island, which is in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and we do have a fair amount of ice just north of our island, but central and northern parts of the Gulf are well below what we'd typically see at this point into late March. for ice cover. So there's less ice there. Also, the offshore ice pack north of Newfoundland is also a lot less than what would typically be normal. So with less ice and temperatures not as cool as they should be in those ocean waters, that will have a big impact in our long-range weather going forward. If the wind is off the water and it's not as cold or as icy as it normally would be, you can typically expect less of a cooling or moderating effect. So I do think we may see a couple of weeks of cooler temperatures into early April, but certainly for Atlantic Canada, we're likely to see those temperatures either return back to seasonal or maybe even above seasonal, offset really because of those warmer temperatures in the Atlantic and the less ice that we're seeing compared to normal in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and offshore of Newfoundland.
Well, Jay, I'm just going to pick it up from there, kind of conversely talking about the west side of the country. We've got a question from Billy Ivel in Vancouver who asks, will it be hot like last year in Vancouver? So we had a very hot and dry summer on the west coast. Jay was talking about warmer than normal temperatures in the Atlantic. Conversely, we've had cooler than normal temperatures in our Pacific, partly due to that undulating jet stream Jay was talking about. And I just want to show you an outlook, Environment Canada's seasonal outlook for the next 3 months, April, May, and June. These warmer colors indicate a higher likelihood that we're looking at a warmer spring. You can see the west coast, a higher likelihood that we're going to look at a cooler than normal spring, and that's partly because we are still under the influence of a La Nina impact, which does impact Western Canada more. This is where cooler than normal ocean temperatures in the equatorial Pacific changes the jet stream and patterns all over the world. So we've got a lingering La Nina, which means cooler for us on the west coast, cooler than normal ocean temperatures, and we've got a heavier snowpack, so that likely means it's going to take a little longer overall for our spring to show up. I know, Christy, you've got some questions about your spring forecast as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, Joe, you mentioned the cooler winter for many, especially with that La Nina. Now, we had a pretty brutal winter for much of the western and central prairies, areas like Alberta, below normal for much of the winter temperature-wise. In some areas in February, 6 degrees below normal. So that's pretty substantial. It was cold. We're still feeling it with this later start to spring. So I have a question from Emma Rudolph from Calgary, and she says, we had a rough winter, will we be in for a nice summer? So again, a little early to be doing that summer forecast. It is a little ways out there, but as for spring, as you've noticed, it's a late start. We're seeing that pretty much across most of the prairies, at least most of the southern prairies. So you can expect temperatures a little cooler than normal. Now, that being said, we're not going to be talking about month after month of -20s and -30s. It is cooler than what you would typically see, so maybe a couple of degrees below normal for the next little while. As for your forecast for the next week or so, it does look like you're going to be in for a little bit of a cool spell and possibly another round of heavy snow for Friday in the Calgary area. It looks like we're going to be seeing another system rolling up, and what we're also seeing is that high pressure moving in over the prairies. Here's a map of Canada. You can actually see that high pressure coming in from the Northwest Territories for the end of the week, as well as moisture coming in from the southwest. So what's that going to do around the Rockies, where you're getting that convergence, that clashing of air masses? It's going to mean a little more snow. So no summer this week for you, I'm sorry, in Calgary. It's going to be a little bit of a cold one out there. Still watching for your questions. If you do have questions, be sure to comment on any of the places you're watching, because I know it's going live in a couple of places. And it looks like we have a couple questions in for Ontario. So I don't know if Jay can
Yeah, I can pick up on that. Yeah, Jackie Hanlon is asking, when is it going to feel like spring here in Ontario? Just look, now keep in mind, my jurisdiction is typically Atlantic Canada, but I did take a boo at the snowfall that you've had over the winter in Ontario, and it looks like once you get north of the lower Great Lakes up into cottage country, for example, you have a departure from normal amounts of snow to the low end, so less snow than typical there, and you are looking at snowfall pretty much around or just above seasonal averages in and around the lower Great Lakes. But a big influence for Western Canada still has an influence into southern Ontario and even slightly into southern Quebec as well, and that is that La Nina El Nino pattern. And right now we are in La Nina. It is weakening La Nina, transitioning to a more neutral phase, but coming out of winter into early spring, that would historically still mean cooler than normal temperatures. We are looking at that first week of April, a big push of with a very big amplified jet stream, allowing for a big trough to allow that cool air to move in from the north. You are looking at cooler temperatures likely into early April. I think beyond that, though, considering we're not looking at a crazy amount of snowfall in southern Ontario, you will see spring arrive. Those temperatures will start to improve quite quickly, likely as you start getting later into the month of April. So after a cool start, you will see spring arrive, maybe a little bit normal or a little bit later than what you would typically consider normal, but it will arrive regardless, nonetheless. Just may take a little bit while to get into those warmer temperatures than probably what you're used to in southern Ontario.
And it's interesting, I mean, to look.
And I just got to jump in, Jay.
Go for it,
yeah.
Johanna.
Oh no, well, I know Christy and I are both excited because, well, I was actually going to say that all three of us have spent a lot of time in Toronto, and so we note that last year was particularly rough as far as your spring summer, and then we had a particularly rough winter for Ontario and Quebec, especially compared to last year as far as cold and snow. So I know many of you were hoping to get to spring, but we are loving this right now because the three of us actually used to work together at CBC Toronto as part of the Weather Center. So this is like such a great meteorological reunion. So yeah, throw out your like nerdiest questions. We are loving this right now.
You know what? I missed Johanna.
You were the one that were hoping for this reunion.
Yes, and I miss, and people don't know, when we worked at the Weather Center, whenever our one shift would end and another shift would begin, we would sit around and have these types of discussions with our big morning meeting, and I really do miss that morning meeting. So this, Christy, thank you for putting this idea together, because I really, it's nice to get a chance to talk to some other weather minds.
I know, it's so nice. And you mentioned Toronto, and I think the last time I saw you, Jay, you were on the back of my snowmobile in Yellowknife and then searching on the ice road for something. So it's been a long time coming, so I'm glad we could have this chat. I'm glad that everyone is asking their questions. We're getting so many good questions. So I'm actually getting one in from Sheikh Gelfand. I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong, which I probably did. It says, with so much snow, how serious is the threat of flooding this spring in Alberta and Saskatchewan? So that's a great question, because it's an interesting question. You talk about a lot of snow, and we did get that, but we got it really late. So I actually have a couple of maps. These ones coming in from Environment Canada, showing us the departure from normal with our snow and our precipitation over the winter. So as you can see, Alberta and Saskatchewan, these dark grays are meaning that we're way below. That's for your December, January, and February. So most of the winter was pretty dry. We were really, really depleting that ground moisture. And then you take the step into March, and things just really changing. We saw heavy precipitation into southern and central Saskatchewan and parts of southern Alberta. All these greens indicating well above normal levels of precipitation for about the last 25 days. So things have changed quite a bit. Now, with this, does this mean we're going to be seeing a lot of flooding? It looks like, despite the snow, unless we get a really fast melt and see a lot of that water running off in the cities, it isn't going to be a huge threat with flooding as we move into the spring and summer months. Talking about our drought conditions, because that was such a sign of last summer. In some areas in Saskatchewan, we saw less than 1 millimeter of rain in the whole month of July, when we should see closer to about 70 or so. So this was our drought condition set up at the end of February. Of course, things have changed drastically through the month of March, with 30+ centimeters in some parts of Saskatchewan. But you can see there were extreme drought conditions in southern Saskatchewan. That drought conditions kind of spreading into Alberta as well. As we move through the next into the next period of assessment, this is from Agroclimate Canada, Agriculture and Agro-Food Canada rather, you can see all of this will start to get a little bit better. So these reds will likely be a little bit closer to orange and that kind of thing. But it all depends on how this snow that we saw melts, because a fast melt and a slow melt are both good and bad for different reasons. So if we see this slow melt like we've been seeing, and it looks like that's what's likely, we're going to start to replenish that groundwater that we've lost so readily last summer. Whereas all those dugouts out in the farmers' fields are pretty much empty for a lot, because we were using so much water to try to keep things going last summer. So a fast melt would replenish those. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, whichever one is better for you depending where you are. As for a spring flood, it's probably not going to be the worst case scenario this spring, with all the dry conditions that kind of set us up for this wetter March.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up, if you don't mind, from what Christy was saying, because this really applies to the West Coast as well in our snowpack. And I've got a question from Florida Ann in the Okanagan. Any chance we'll get at least a bit of spring? Are we going to jump straight into summer one of these days? I'd love to get my outrigger on the water one of these days. Yeah, fair enough. Last year we really saw that quick transition, and that speaks to what Christy was saying about how fast that snow melt happens. And going to the same graph from Environment Canada that Christy had, we too on the West Coast dealt with drought conditions. But in the north, in the south, we are almost double in some cases the snowpack from departure from normal. So we've got a lot of snowpack. I know officials and people are already worried about if we're going to look at those big spring floods. We had a taste of them just last week with some thunderstorms, and last year was a big year for spring flooding in the interior. With a cooler than normal forecast, we can hope for a slower melt. On the flip side, talking to fire ecologists, hoping that the snowpack will mean maybe a less extreme fire season. Not always the case. That transition can happen so quickly and we can dry out so fast. So unfortunately, the clues that we do have in the atmosphere, we don't always have a lot of clues. We've got a weakening La Nina, so we've got a bit of a clue for the West Coast, but not a great amount of confidence in the forecast. But it is indicating that we might be looking at one of these quick switches from spring to summer again, I'm afraid.
And I'm going to jump in. I've got a question from Robbie Livingston asking, are we getting any more big snow here on PEI? And I will say, well, I don't see anything in the immediate forecast. In fact, tonight my big concern is actually going to be freezing rain. There is the potential for some freezing rain. So wintry precipitation, yes. Going forward, that sun is getting higher in the sky. We did see a lack of snowfall over certainly much of the Maritimes. I will say that folks that are watching maybe in central and northern New Brunswick, that is where you saw a more typical winter with a good round of a few good rounds of some very heavy snow there. But our departure from normal in terms of snowfall for the eastern Maritimes, certainly here on PEI, we were well below what we should typically see for our snowfall. But that does not mean, as we now are into spring, that we're not going to get a nor'easter style system that pushes up the east coast and does bring a good dumping of snow. Really, the difference is this time of year, as we get into April, it becomes less and less likely, and it's less likely that the snow will actually stick around all that long. But I will say, with a big push of cool air moving in next week, so as we get into early April, we do have temperatures in the Atlantic, like I was saying, where much warmer than normal. But something you have to consider with temperatures that are warmer than normal with those sea surface temperatures is the warmer the water is, the more water vapor is in the atmosphere and the more precipitation these storms can produce. So yes, it is possible that we could be seeing a heavy wet snow event in the next few weeks. But the longer we get into April, the less and less likely we'll be seeing the wintry precipitation as we do eventually switch over to that more summery precipitation in the long term throughout the month of throughout the coming months into spring. But still not ruling it out that we could get another round of snow as we get into early April here on PEI. It certainly historically would not be that odd of an occurrence to see a snowstorm in April here on the island.
I'm just going to jump in
and
because I noticed
snow, Christy.
So much snow always. We're probably going to get a little more snow in our neck of the woods. I was going to jump in and say that, yes, our slow start to spring is probably going to continue for most. I did mention Calgary getting a little bit of snow probably towards the end of the week. In some areas, you could see 10+ centimeters. A little bit further towards the east in through the central prairies into Manitoba a little bit. It might be a little bit drier for us over the next little while. We're going to be falling into that lovely Arctic high pressure that makes it so nice and cold but sunny out there for the next little while. So we might see a few flurries, especially into next week, but as for the next little while, it will be pretty dry, and it has been a dry March for Manitoba as well, so that's going to continue a little bit over the next little while. I also noticed we do have a question for the group, which is an interesting question, and I actually don't know if I know the answer off the top of my head, so I'm interested to see what you guys think. It's from Andrew Bergeron, and he's saying, I've seen agriculture reports based on sunspots. Do you guys have an opinion on sunspot-based forecasting? I've actually never seen that for agriculture forecasting. I usually look at sunspots if I'm trying to forecast for the aurora or something like that. I don't know about you guys, though, if you have any thoughts.
I would say no, just space weather,
yeah,
so aurora forecasting. I've never heard of forecasting agriculture with sunspots before. That's new to me.
Yeah, no, I'm with you guys. Same thing. For any sort of weather or even climatological forecast, definitely it's what's happening in our atmosphere that's the bigger driver. I mean, when we're talking about sun influences, these are over much larger timescales, and the influences are nowhere near what we get with our own jet streams and semi-permanent features. So, I mean, full respect for farmers and how they come up with their yearly forecasts and outlooks, but definitely from a meteorological perspective, that is not something that we look at. But good question.
Yeah,
these are great questions.
I should point out,
and you know what? I might as well keep going.
Oh.
Well, I just wanted a quick one from Sebastian Alejandro Cortez. How will the danger of fire be for BC and Alberta this spring and summer compared to last year? I know this is something, we've got a couple of questions on this topic that a lot of people are thinking of, especially after the record-breaking fires last season in both British Columbia and Alberta. And as I mentioned earlier, I was actually talking to some fire ecologists in British Columbia. Even though we've got a high snowpack in the south, the rest of BC is still looking at below normal snowpacks, going back to this graph from Environment Canada. And as Christy mentioned, Alberta and parts of the southern prairies well below normal for snowpack. And that's only one of many factors that go into fire forecasting. And unfortunately, something that we're seeing more and more of as our climate changes is that the spring and winter predictors aren't always lining up with what happens in our summer. So we can have a lot of snow. That melt happens so rapidly, things dry out so quickly that we can still have a dangerous fire season. And generally the trend is for longer, hotter seasons. I know here on the West Coast, we're anxiously awaiting that big high pressure that sets up out in the Pacific that generally means we get hot and dry summers. So I know myself and other fire forecasters will be watching that switch that will likely happen pretty quickly by the end of spring.
And it's interesting you mentioned fire forecasting, because it was something we saw a little bit in the prairies, not so much this past summer, maybe right at the end as we got into those very dry months. But it happens so quickly, because even in northern Saskatchewan, we saw a pretty wet start to the season. Most of the summer was not too bad. And then southern Saskatchewan, although you saw maybe a little bit of wet weather into May, as soon as we got into that June and the July, where we were well below normal, in some areas not seeing any rainfall at all. It was almost like a bubble of weather was set up over the province. That fire risk just went up so quickly, and what that means is that fires not only start more easily, but they spread and can get out of control very quickly. So it's always something to look at, especially when you get well, in the prairies, if you get something called an omega block set up in our upper atmosphere. What that means is we're seeing the jet stream kind of bubbling over central Canada and bringing with it that dry and persistent weather. And once that starts to set up, that's when I start to look at those fire risks, because it can get really extreme very quickly.
Oh, guys, this question, do you want me to take this one? I want to say
tell us about it in PE.
All right.
You start.
Yeah, okay, this is a touchy one. Do you think people would trust meteorologists more if there was a system for accountability for inaccurate forecasting? And that was from Stampy Bear, which, by the way, coolest name so far in this little live edition here. No, I don't think people would trust meteorologists more if there was a system of accountability.
I mean,
of course I'm going to say that. I hope you don't mean prison or anything like that. But I think, honestly, I think there is a system of accountability. Every time that I've forecasted, and it's happened a few times, this is my first winter storm season here on PEI, and there was a couple of storm systems where I would be forecasting heavier amounts of snow, and then we would see an area of low pressure start to push up the U.S. East Coast. Forecast models would not necessarily be in agreement even 48, 24 hours out. And by the time I put my forecast out at 6 o'clock Atlantic time in the evening, and by the time the storm system arrived the following morning, it might have tracked a few hundred or maybe 100 kilometers further west than I was forecasting, which here in the Maritimes, and this could happen anywhere in Canada, that can be a huge difference in not just the amount of snow you see, but the type of precipitation you even see. We're talking about a short deviation in a storm system can result in 30 centimeters of snow falling as 10 centimeters of snow, and then 10 millimeters of ice accretion and another 20 millimeters of rain. So there is a few times where we'll see these systems not play out as expected, and every time that has happened, My system of accountability is the voicemails, the emails. When I go to the grocery store to go shopping, people let me know when I was wrong, and I don't think any of us really like when we get a wrong forecast. But forecasting the weather is a very complicated thing, and no one is ever going to be right all the time. And what I try to do is to really paint a picture of what forecasting is like. So imagine a frying pan on a stove, a skillet, a good cast iron skillet. And what I want you to do is to pour just a few millimeters of cooking oil into that frying pan. Now what you're going to do is you're going to start turning on and turning off the burner on the stove while turning that frying pan 360 degrees. So that frying pan is being heated up, and then it's cooling down, and it's spinning. And think of that cooking oil. You're not going to forecast for a certain point on the pan. You're going to forecast for a certain point on that cooking oil for one spot on the frying pan, while all of that swirling, the heat going on, the heat going off, different times of the day or year, there's more heat or less heat. And you've got to figure out for one little area on that frying pan in that cooking oil, which is moving around, that's our atmosphere, you've got to figure out what the temperature, the conditions, the type of precipitation, the wind direction will be doing at a specific time in the future. And you have to do that for 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7 days out in advance. It's a very, very, very complicated thing to get right. And I think I speak for all of us when I say we always try to be right. And I think most often our forecast for the next day or even the next couple of days is very accurate, but every now and then we get a storm system that we have to eat a little bit of crow, and I think the accountability is certainly here as TV meteorologists hearing about those days from our viewers.
I like that, and I thought that was going a different way. It's kind of like noon.
CJ, yeah.
It's kind of like noon here, so I was like, I'm getting kind of hungry. Is he talking about weather?
Yeah.
No, but it's
too. Yeah, I can't actually CJ, but I was really hoping he had a frying pan.
No, I did not have a frying pan. I did not have a frying pan.
Oh, no, but it's so true. I mean, it's really, sometimes, especially with long-range forecasts, I always kind of use the analogy, it's throwing a dart at a moving dartboard. It can be so different, and a little bit of a change can make such a big difference in the long range. And I mean, what other people maybe don't notice is if we've missed kind of one area, that weather hasn't just vanished. It's probably somewhere else. We've just missed the location a little bit. So a lot goes into forecasting. I know we look at, as meteorologists, a number of different weather models that use mathematical equations to kind of take a look at what's happening now and project what's going to be happening in the future, but it's not exactly sound. And when people ask about forecasting, I kind of think of it almost as one of the most artistic sciences there are, because there's so many things to look at, and things can be so different, and you're learning and learning the whole time, because even if models are saying something different, I always use the example of the Cypress Hills in Saskatchewan. So basically it's kind of like a little mini Calgary situation going on there. They get a little bit of that heat coming down from the hills, and so they're usually our little California. They're warmer than everywhere else. So it's a lot of fun forecasting, but you have to be okay with being wrong sometimes, and hopefully jail time for wrong forecasts won't happen ever.
Yeah. No, that's scary.
Yeah. Very scary. But, you know, I mean, this is obviously a topic we're really passionate about. We do have personal accountability. Part of our job is checking our own forecast. A forecast verification is what we call it. Every day we come in and see how our forecast from the day before held up, and we go back and figure out what models worked better for this situation. We actually talk as meteorologists a lot amongst ourselves. We talk about what models are handling different situations better. So that's actually one of my favorite parts about the job, is constantly learning from each other and constantly learning in what is a very exciting field, and we're getting better and better at it all the time. So speaking of forecasting, Christy, you have a very tricky snow forecast question, I think, from Edmonton.
I do. I see this. This is from Marlene Langveld Mooney, and Edmonton's actually my hometown, so I understand the pain. We're seeing it across the prairies. She says, is this going to be the last storm? I've pretty much had enough. I feel like that's a pretty uniform thought for the prairies, because it's been a brutal March with snow. Here's a look at our system outlook for the next little while. This is the system that's caused all of that havoc today with the snow. As we move through the next 24 hours, that's moving off until into Saskatchewan and then into Manitoba. You're going to get a little bit of a break, but watch for that second round of snow as you move later into the week. So is it the end? Probably not. It is March. It looks like this March is going in like a lion and going out like a lion in most of the prairies. So brace yourself, and you know, think about all of the workouts you have to skip because you're shoveling so much. Maybe, I don't know.
And I got a question asking me what about Toronto as well. So a question regarding Toronto with that big push of cool air moving in for next week, really over the Easter weekend. Don't be afraid if you see a few flakes falling from the sky at time. I think that seasonal would be around 5 or 6 right now. By the time you get into early next week, a seasonal temperature in Toronto is probably pushing 7, 8+ degrees. So we start to see those seasonal values climbing quite quickly through the first few weeks of April, and you're going to be seeing temperatures well below seasonal. Certainly through the weekend. It may spike up a little bit early next week and then another dip in those temperatures again. So you're not out of the woods from seeing at least a few flakes mixing in with those showers at times as well. And that was a question going out to regarding Toronto and what you can expect there. I don't forget that 6 months ago I was the local meteorologist in Toronto, so shout out to all my peeps in the 6 as well.
Well said, well said. Yeah, we're getting some amazing questions on Facebook and YouTube. If you're just joining us, we've got time for definitely a few more questions. You've got 3 CBC meteorologists spread out across the country to answer your questions. I've got one to the group, which maybe you guys can help me out with. I don't know a lot about, but Adam Peace comments, people should refer to the Farmer's Almanac. Is that really accurate? So it's an interesting question for those of you who know. The Farmer's Almanac comes out on a yearly basis with predictions for the season ahead. I think there is a lot of truth to some of the, sort of old wives' tales or sayings when it comes to weather, because things like, red sky at night, sailor's delight, that is based on science of observations from one day that may give way to approaching systems the next day. So I think there's some truth in these long-term traditions and predictions that have been passed down through time. But generally our atmosphere is so much more complicated than that, and when you're looking at precipitation and temperature forecasts over a short or long-term period, there are a lot of atmospheric factors that dominate, and things can change so quickly, which is why these seasonal outlooks are always so tricky, and there are so many clues that we look for in the atmosphere. I don't know, have you guys looked a lot into the accuracy of almanacs?
No, to be honest, I personally don't use a Farmer's Almanac or put much stock into that forecast. It is a statistical form of forecasting, and we do use statistical forms of forecasting to balance out some of the numerical or the forecast models that we use. I know statistical forecasting comes in very handy when it comes to storm tracks with tropical systems, for example. So I don't want to speak too negatively about the Farmer's Almanac, but Johanna, I think you hit the nail on the head. Sometimes these old wives' tales that we hear about, or these old farmers' tales that we hear about, like red sky at night, do have truth to them. And one of the coolest ones that I thought is, I just thought of, is telling the temperature with crickets. You can actually count the cricket chirps, and there's a little mathematical formula, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but you can Google it, and you can actually tell the temperature, I believe, to within less than a degree Celsius by counting the chirps of a cricket. So there are all these really cool weather lore and old farmers' tales that often do have some truth to them and actually do work out. So, but no, I'm not a big user of the Farmer's Almanac forecast. I tend to stick to looking at the forecast models and the guidance, looking at the various forecast models when it comes to putting together my forecast.
Yeah, I totally agree. I usually look more towards the models as opposed to the Farmer's Almanac, but it's so interesting to read and see how they can be accurate at sometimes. I mean, certain winters they call it perfectly, and certain, of course, they do not. But it's really interesting about the Farmer's Almanac, because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but we did do an interview with someone from the Farmer's Almanac, and they said that it's a secret formula that only one person knows on how they base that, which I think is really cool, because you're like a Farmer's Almanac secret agent. But again, it's a very interesting tool. Do I use it all the time? No, but it's another resource, right? It gives you that idea of how to forecast maybe outside the box without using all the data that we have today.
And I will say, in defense of the Farmer's Almanac, when it comes to the type of long-range forecasts that we do for seasonal outlooks, if you were to look at the batting average, so to speak, at certainly temperature is getting better, but when it comes to precipitation, is it going to be a wetter or drier spring? That's the question I don't think too many of us even really touched on, Johanna and Christy. When it comes to the batting average of trying to forecast for an entire season, even the way that meteorologists and climatologists and atmospheric scientists do pour into those long-range forecasting, the end result is often probably not much better than a farmer's almanac in some cases, certainly when it comes to precipitation. It's not the most accurate. It's a very challenging thing to forecast, and the result is often far from correct.
Yeah, it's so true. In fact, if I can just take you back on that point, Jay, because I've got a question from Penny Shaver in BC Boundary Country asking, what is the forecast for July and August in BC? Will it be hot and dry or warm and damp? So one of the tools we do use is Environment Canada's seasonal outlook, and I've got here the probability that we're going to see a departure above or below normal when it comes to temperature. So the darker the reds means the higher confidence Environment Canada has, based on statistical analysis and their long-range models, that it's going to be warmer. The darker the blues, better chance that it's going to be colder. So right now, as we mentioned earlier, fairly high confidence that much of central and eastern Canada will be warmer than normal for the spring. But look down at temperature. So green is wetter, brown is drier, and there is not much better than chance when it comes to precipitation across the country that it'll be leaning any way over the other. And precipitation is very tough because we've got such small scale weather patterns impacting all of the regions, whereas temperature anomalies are much easier to see into the forecast. Well, much easier in quotation marks. So going back to British Columbia question, generally, even though our forecast for the spring is cooler than normal, hard to say what that translates to with precipitation, but generally La Nina means also wetter than normal. But in summer, we do get these big high pressure systems, this big semi-permanent high pressure feature building off our west coast, and it always builds right around July, and that's why British Columbians often can expect a hot and dry July, August, and September. So this is one of those features that comes back almost every year. How long it stays around and just how hot it'll be, there's variability in that, but I have fairly high confidence that we will eventually see a hot summer, and that is a trend that is growing. Our summers are getting hotter and drier here on the west coast.
Oh, do you guys want to field this one? I think you see another question there that appeals to all of us. Is there any credence? This is coming from Howard Mackey. Geldart is asking the three of us, is there any credence whatsoever to Groundhog Day? No.
No.
I think we also take a deep breath before we answer this.
It's like a love-hate relationship.
Before we start raging.
Okay, so we do this, you know, bar like maybe a few weeks of vacation. We do this 48 weeks a year. They do it one day. And they get national headlines, international headlines, and all this pomp and ceremony, and there's music, and there's a town crier.
Deep soothing breaths, Jay. Deep soothing.
We're not bitter.
If only
We're
I
not
had
bitter.
somebody, hear ye, Jay Scotland is here with his 7-day forecast. That never happens to me. I don't have anybody wearing period costume announcing my arrival into the studio and throngs of people cheering as I get there. Am I bitter? No. No. But no, there's no stock into, you know, here, if it's sunny, shadow. If we have some humidity in the upper atmosphere, lower atmosphere, and it results in some cloud cover, no shadow. So overcast, no shadow, sunny, shadow. That's
He's really good at saying if it's sunny out right now.
Yes, he can let you know if it's sunny at that moment where that groundhog is. Plus, he bit Brett Ruskin, by the way, our intrepid CBC reporter in Nova Scotia was bitten by a groundhog.
That's true.
So they're also very dangerous animals. Well, that one was.
They may be cute, but do not underestimate them.
I'm actually nervous that I
think somebody actually did an
now.
analysis. Yeah, you know, you better watch out, Jay. But I think somebody actually did an analysis of what the accuracy of Canadian groundhogs were, and I think it was like 40% accuracy, which is not better than chance. I mean, I'm just saying, based on fact, I would trust the meteorologists, but they are cute.
They are very cute. We have a couple more questions. We're running out of time quickly, but this one is for you, Jay, so I'm going to ask you because I think it's funny. It's from Mark Hickox, and he says, if it gets to 15, will you be shaving, Jay?
People are asking me about the beard. Look, it took me till I was 35 years old to hit puberty, okay? Now that I've got this beard, do you know how much Rogaine I have to slap on these cheeks to get a full beard like this? No, I will not be shaving. I'm a big fan of the beard. I got a little bit of a double chin that's forming, and it hides it very well. It's got some gray coming in right now. That would be the only motivation to maybe shave it. So not if it becomes 15, Mark, but if it starts to become more than 40% gray, may have to swing down to Ray's Barbershop on Kent Street and get that shave. But until then, nope.
Rock the beard, just like Peter Mansbridge and David Letterman.
Exactly.
No,
yeah, it becomes a prestige thing. Hey, I think we've got like
a few minutes.
Yeah,
okay.
I know. There is a line. There is a line. I think we've only got a minute or two left. Yeah, well, let's just end off with what part of Canada is going to have the best summer.
PEI.
So I'll start off, and I'm going to say, even though our spring is not looking great, BC, I think there's a chance we'll get back to our hot and dry. What say you guys?
I don't know if you guys have seen a prairie summer, but it's pretty much the best part about living here. It's amazing. So, I mean, last summer was really dry, and that was sad. But I don't know. It's going to be... Hey, Regina. It's going to be Regina.
No. 800 kilometers of white and red sand beaches and the warmest waters north of the Carolinas in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. PEI is going to have the best summer. You just can't beat that island summer on the beach, is all I'm going to say.
Where we have to agree to disagree, I guess.
Okay, so we may be a bit biased. Yeah, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. I think that's all the time we have, but we had way too much fun. I want to thank you for joining us on Facebook and YouTube. We're going to be online afterwards if you've got questions. Maybe we can follow up with some links and things like that. And hopefully we can do this again. Thank you from the West Coast.
From the central part of Canada. Yay.
And from the East Coast here in Prince Edward Island.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Stay warm.
I have a squeaky